Political economist Khaya Sithole joins us now to weigh in on policy issues that are to be discussed at the gathering. Policy issues that have failed to produce the desired results for South Africa so far. Policy issues that divide the ANC and, most importantly, policy issues that can take South Africa forward, whether carried by the ANC or another political party. He joins us now via Zoom. Khaya, it's been a while. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Good evening and good evening to the viewers.
All right, Khaya, you heard the president speak this evening. He was speaking to the business community. Was his message inspiring?
It could have been inspiring for the people that were in the room, because obviously people who are in business and people who are happy to support the ANC as business leaders have particular expectations, and they've got a particular relationship that they enjoy with the party. So the things that matter to them, or the things that they want to hear from a president of the ANC, are materially different from what the rest of us would like to hear. So that comes down to a question of, do they believe that the ANC is still committed to the economic pathway that provides them with sufficient opportunities to support and work with the state? And if it sticks to that, then of course it's inspiring to them. But anything that deviates against that creates anxieties, and that is the type of thing that makes people very worried about what the future country's policy direction is going to be.
Again, you know, we look at history and we've seen a number of these conferences over time, promises, decisions made, conference resolutions. Perhaps just before we start diving in, do you have any expectation that anything's going to come out of this? It's being described as a watershed moment for the party and maybe even for the country.
I think when it comes to matters of policy, some of the most drastic or even decisive policies are policies that were deliberated on in 2017. And in 2017, it was quite clear that the ANC wanted to sort of try and imagine a way in which it could simultaneously keep a strong hold on the economic levers of the state and also start growing the economy, whilst also trying to provide support for a lot of citizens that were marginalized and excluded from the community. And that has been a struggle. So for the past 5 years, so many other things have just simply not worked out. So it is very difficult to imagine that they will have had the hindsight to look at new policies and then implement or propose new policies tomorrow that are going to be materially different from what we've heard from them before. So I do not believe that there's going to be new drastic policy orientations. It's rather a consolidation of what they've said before. And unfortunately, a lot of what they've said before, they simply never follow up on it. They never execute on their own policy direction. So it is quite problematic.
I was just about to ask that actually, because what we hear often is that the policies themselves are not fundamentally problematic and that some of them are actually quite good. The failure becomes in implementation. And so they'll sit for 5 days, they'll discuss, they'll debate, but will it matter if the wrong people are sitting in the positions that are supposed to be implementing these things?
I think even before you get to the question of the people that are supposed to do the implementation, a lot of these policies, unfortunately, tend to occur in what is really a resource vacuum, in that none of the policies get tested at conference floor against the question of, well, if we say that's what we're going to do, what are the resources that are required to do it from the state itself? What are the resources required from the party? And what are the resources required from society? And then on the basis of that, then say, okay, this policy is a go or this policy is a no-go. So what happens over the next 5 years is that everybody essentially comes up with a very ambitious plan or a very ambitious idea of what they wish a utopia would look like. And they sign up for all of this. Some of them actually are in conflict with each other, because if you pursue a policy that says that we want to, contain the spending in the state, for example, and also then try to expand the role of government in the state, well, those things cannot actually work hand in hand. You have to be able to decide which way you're going and how you're going. So unfortunately, by the time you start hearing all the policy resolutions, if you map them against each other firstly, and then you map them against the state resources and also some of the geopolitical considerations, you find them lacking in substance. So what then happens is that 5 years later, they come back and then they realize that, well, actually, even from the moment they actually said that it was going to be a policy, it was quite simply never going to happen for a variety of reasons. And I think they'll spend a bit of time debating and reflecting on those. Unfortunately, they didn't have the benefit of a National General Council, which is essentially the midterm conference, which would have enabled them to be a bit more robust in interrogating, are we on the path towards executing on these policies? And if we are not, what needs to be done? So the great COVID interruption did not help. But I do, unfortunately, I have seen in the past that a lot of these policies really sound good on paper. They sound like good rhetoric, but in reality, it's just not going to be possible to implement them, particularly for a party that is fast losing access to the controlling levers of the economy. It's fast losing, the ability to dominate politically in the big metros, for example, which is where it has the greatest capacity to really show us the effect and the success of its policies.
Before, it used to be that the whole country must listen to what comes out of this conference because we knew that the ANC was going to be the governing party, and so what they decide was going to affect our futures. Is it the same now? Because people are speculating there may not be the powering party, in which case, how do we digest what happens in the next 5 years, 5 months, 5 days?
It's different compared to previous policy and conference gatherings, because for a long time, the ANC was so dominant in the political landscape. They had no fear of coming up with a policy that was so drastic in nature. It would require, for example, a 2/3 majority in parliament, because they knew that whether from their own resources or from alliances with other parties, they'd be able to get it there. So obviously, since they've gradually lost that ability to essentially bulldoze policy through and implement things unilaterally, it becomes a bit more difficult to imagine how they plan on, for example, reiterating the question around land expropriation without compensation, when in instances where they committed to it as recently as 5 years ago, and they were then given the ability to do it by the EFF promising to support them, they still didn't do it. And that's at the point in time where they were still relatively more powerful. So when you look beyond 2024 and you imagine and you map that against their waning influence and the fact that they're going to start being more dependent on other parties to support their agenda, it becomes difficult to imagine how the process becomes easier rather than more difficult, because all the other parties will then know that they've got some element of bargaining power over the ANC, and if they simply don't support a particular resolution and it just doesn't make its way through the legislative process, then that's where it's going to die. So I think what you said, that previously people used to pay much greater attention on the basis that as soon as the ANC says that, nothing can stop it from being implemented. We are fast moving away from that particular period, where even if they say something, we then have to look at the question of, well, what will it take for it to actually be turned into law? Will there be legislative impediments or legal impediments rather? Because we do know, unfortunately, that in a lot of what the ANC has done, it has then found itself at odds with the constitution that it itself presided over. The most recent example of that is obviously with the procurement regulations, where the ANC has been very clear that it remains committed to transforming public procurement, and yet its own bureaucrats then wrote the type of rules that were then thrown out by the Constitutional Court. They then scrambled together to put together some interim measures, which have caused even more confusion among society. And now they're then saying that after this conference, they will then go to Parliament and table the public procurement bill. So it indicates that even in instances where they've got, the greatest electoral influence, they still shoot themselves in the foot in far too many instances. And beyond 2024, that will be more fatal, because once they lose it at the first instance, they're unlikely to convince other parties to support them once they've messed up the initial iteration of a policy formulation process.
Do you think it's still clear what the ANC stands for? That if you say the ANC, this is what you think of in terms of policy, in terms of what they're trying to do for the people. Is it as clear now as it used to be back in the day?
No, it isn't. And the reality here is that there are some defining pillars or defining policy principles that you can associate the ANC with. They're definitely pro-poor, and they definitely have a particular agenda that seeks to address much of what had happened before 1994. Unfortunately, the ANC cannot detach itself from the fact that as the party in government, it also has custodianship over the resources that are necessary to execute on that particular agenda. So for a very long time, it has been a party that just said, well, we are going to pursue this particular agenda without understanding that the trade-offs themselves have to be embedded into that particular process. So if you look, for example, at how we've expanded the social coverage net, there's many more people now that are getting some form of assistance, financial assistance from the state. But that, of course, is only sustainable if you are growing the economy in such a way that the tax revenues that are necessary to support that expanding social network coverage can be funded. And I think for a very long time, the ANC has been very more able to pursue one part of the dimension and neglect the other fundamental parts of it. You see the same problem with the way it's managed state-owned enterprises, in that it's been very clear that for many of the state-owned enterprises, they serve a public purpose and an economic purpose. In serving the public purpose, the best way to ensure that they can execute on their social mandate is to ensure that they remain within the hands of the state, which is the state that has the ability to say, look, this is where we think the resources ought to be directed, and not always driven by a question of, well, the resources must only go to the people that can afford them. So that's fine. So if you do believe that poor citizens need to be able to get access to basic electricity, basic water, that is indeed an agenda that we all support. The problem is that once you start mismanaging the entities that are supposed to make that happen, you actually then don't have the resources to distribute anyway. So it doesn't matter how committed you are to the cause of the poor. If the resources simply do not exist, then there's nothing to distribute. So for a very long time, it's been a party that's been quite happy to pursue one part of the conundrum and hope that the other part sorts itself out. And unfortunately, reality was always going to meet them halfway, and here we are.
All right, Khaya, I look forward to a few more chats with you over the next few days. Thanks so much indeed for joining us tonight and reflecting on the days ahead. Thanks so much. All right, that's political economist Khaya Sithole speaking ahead of the ANC's national conference, which kicks off in earnest tomorrow. There was a dinner earlier this evening that saw the president of the party delivering a welcome speech, I guess.